The intake form used the phrase, "threat designation," 3 times in the first paragraph alone. I read it twice, standing at the charge desk in the blue-gray pre-shift light of Thresh Station 14's lower ward, the recycled air smell of the place settling around me the way it always did at the start of a long night, industrial solvent, laundry steam, and something older underneath that I'd never entirely been able to name. I'd worked this station for 11 years. I knew every sound its old ore processing bones made as the temperature dropped at night, every flicker pattern of the overhead strips, every grate and rattle of the freight lifts in the walls. I knew the intake forms the way I knew my own handwriting. I'd read 1,000 of them. This one was different. Subject: adult male battle dragon Korethven bloodline. Approximate age: mature adult. Estimated 240 standard cycles. Received via emergency medical transport, non-responsive on arrival. Injuries: both primary flight wings severely lacerated, secondary ligament and membrane loss approximately 70% of total surface area. Spinal compression wound, lower dorsal region, resulting in confirmed paralysis of both rear limbs. Internal hemorrhaging status: controlled but ongoing at time of transfer. Combat-related. Triage category: high resource, low survival probability. And then at the bottom, in the small box labeled disposition recommendation, someone had typed, "Resource withdrawal pending administrative review." That was the bureaucratic phrase. It meant they'd written him off. I stood there for a moment with the form in my hand. Behind me, the ward was quiet, 8 occupied bays, all of them sleeping or sedated, the monitors doing their slow green work. Outside the ward's reinforced bay doors, which we kept closed at night, I could hear the distant sound of the station's main docking ring, a low harmonic groan that came and went with the pressure differentials, 3 levels up. The relay scout was asleep in its usual corner, tucked under the intake desk the way it had been every night for the past 6 weeks. A small thing, barely larger than a barn cat, wings folded tight against its body, scales the dull bronze gray of Old River stone. I'd started finding it near the staff kitchen drain about a month and a half ago, drawn in by food scraps, I'd assumed, or warmth. Nobody else on the ward paid it any mind. Interspecies wildlife in the frontier zones was common enough. The station's environmental seals weren't perfect, and small draconic fauna wandered in from the transit corridors all the time. I'd set out a dish of kitchen scraps the second night I found it there, and it had eaten from the dish without raising its head. We'd had an understanding since. I looked at the relay scout. It cracked one amber eye and watched me with the particular quality of attention that small animals sometimes have, the stillness of something that is very carefully listening. Then I set the intake form down on the desk, picked up my supply kit, and went to Bay 12. The bay doors were rated for heavy class containment. They were 3 inches of composite alloy, hydraulically sealed, with a transparent observation panel the size of my palm in the upper left corner. I looked through it first. He was enormous. Even collapsed, even inert, even stripped of the authority that a standing battle dragon commands, the scale of him filled the bay almost to capacity. The medical transport team had managed to get him onto the recovery platform. I would learn later it had taken 6 of them and a freight lift harness. And he lay on his left side, great head turned slightly toward the wall, the right side of his face pressed into the platform padding. His scales were a deep, burnished crimson, like old iron left long in a fire, with a dark undertone of black along the ridged lines of his spine, or what remained of his spine's external structure. The wound was high on his lower dorsal, and the dressings the transport medics had applied were already dark with seepage. The wings were the worst of it. A battle dragon's primary flight wings are not like the wings of smaller species. They are architectural. They are frameworks of bone and cartilage and membrane that, when fully extended, can span 30 feet or more on an adult male of Zareth size. What remained of his looked like something a storm had torn apart and put back wrong. The leading edges had been shredded, not cleanly, the way a blade does it, but raggedly, the way something explosive or sustained does it. I'd seen blast damage before, in my first 3 years at the station when the frontier skirmishes were closer. I recognized the pattern. Someone had been trying to ground him permanently. I unsealed the bay doors and went in. The smell was different in there, the mineral sharpness of dragon blood, which is nothing like human blood, more like hot copper and stone, and underneath it the deeper musk of a very large creature in severe physical distress. I'd smelled it before, not at this scale, but I knew it. He didn't react when I entered. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and each exhale carried a faint vibration from somewhere deep in his chest. Not a growl, not a warning, just the sound a massive body makes when it's working very hard at the simple task of continuing. I pulled a stool to the side of the recovery platform and sat down. I set my supply kit on the floor. I didn't open it yet. "Hello," I said. "Nothing. My name is Vera. I work the night shift here. I'm the nurse who's going to be looking after you." "Nothing." His eyes stayed closed. One of his claws, his front left, the only limb he seemed able to move even slightly, flexed once against the platform padding and then went still again. I studied the dressings on his wings. The transport team had done their best, which was better than nothing and not as good as what needed doing. The binding on the leading edge of the right wing had already slipped, and the membrane below it was pulling at an angle that would cause more tearing if he shifted in his sleep. I stood up, I opened my kit, I started working. It took most of the first night just to get the dressings right. Wing membrane on a battle dragon of his size is not the same material as skin, but it behaves something like skin in that it needs support, not just covering, and the angle of support matters. I'd assisted in 2 wing stabilization procedures in my years at Thresh Station, both on smaller species, both done by the day shift surgical team under full sedation. What I was doing now was improvised and careful and slow. I worked by feel as much as by sight, because the lighting in Bay 12 was not ideal and I did not want to bring in more equipment. Not yet. Not on a first night with a patient who was not conscious but who was still, somewhere in that great still body, registering the world. I talked while I worked. That's a habit I'd had since my 2nd year in the profession, when an older colleague had told me that patients in low consciousness states often retain auditory processing longer than we assume, and that the sound of a human voice speaking in a calm, unhurried register can lower cortisol markers measurably even in patients who show no other signs of awareness. I didn't know if dragon neurology mapped to human neurology in that regard. I suspected it didn't, not exactly. But I'd kept the habit anyway because it kept me steady and because it seemed like the decent thing to do. I talked about the station, the way the freight lifts groaned at night, the particular quality of the pre-dawn light when it came through the high clear-story windows of the upper processing level, which you could see from the ward's east-facing bays if you stood at the right angle. The fact that the staff kitchen made a rice porridge on Thursday mornings that was worth getting up early for, even though most of my colleagues didn't bother. I talked about the relay scout under the intake desk, the small bronze-gray one I'd been feeding for 6 weeks. "She sits under the desk and watches everything," I said, working carefully at the adhesive edge of a dressing on his right wing's proximal joint. "I don't know if she understands any of it, but she pays attention. You can tell by the way she holds her head." I paused. The dressing came free cleanly and I repositioned it. I like that about her. She takes the work seriously. His breathing changed very slightly. Not in quality, it was still ragged, still that shallow labor, but in rhythm. It steadied just barely, barely enough to notice. I noticed. I kept talking, I kept working. Sometime around 4 in the morning, I finished with the wing dressings, repositioned his lower limbs, the paralyzed ones, which had been left at an angle that would cause secondary pressure damage over time, and cleaned the dorsal wound as much as I could reach without disturbing the transport team's deeper dressing, which would need the day surgeons. Then I went to the staff kitchen, ladled warm broth from the pot that sat on the low burner all night for the ambulatory patients, and brought back a bowl. I set it near his head, where he could smell it if he surfaced enough to register smell. I sat on my stool and waited. At 5:40 in the morning, just as the station's lights were beginning their slow cycle toward day shift brightness, one amber eye opened. It found me immediately. That was the first thing I noticed, not the searching sweep of a creature coming out of sedation, scanning for threat vectors, processing its environment. He opened his eye and it found me, and it stayed there. The iris was extraordinary up close, layered gold and deep amber, with a pupil that contracted very slowly in the increasing light. I'd read that Korathven dragons have exceptional low-light vision, adapted to their bloodline's origins in the high cave systems of the Thresh Plateau. I didn't know if that was accurate. What I knew was that this eye, looking at me from a distance of about 4 feet, carried in it the weight of something I couldn't name, not hostility, not threat, not the animal wariness I'd have expected from a wounded creature of his size coming aware in an unfamiliar place. What it carried was shame. I'd seen that look before. Not in a dragon. I'd never worked with a dragon of this lineage before, never worked with a battle-class adult of any lineage, really. But I'd seen that quality of stillness in human patients in the years before I transferred to the frontier stations. The ones who'd been in accidents that were partly their fault, or who'd lost someone, or who'd done something in a moment of crisis that they couldn't put back. The ones who woke up and looked at you, and you could see them waiting, not to be told they were going to live or die, but to be told what you thought of them. "Good morning," I said. The eye stayed on me. His breathing was still labored, but steadier than it had been. "You've got a long way to go," I said, "but you're here and I'm here and we're going to get started." I nodded toward the bowl of broth. "That's for you when you're ready. It's warm. There's nothing complicated in it." He didn't move. He couldn't move much. The paralysis in his rear limbs was real and the wing dressings restricted his upper body. But the eye moved. It went to the bowl and then it came back to me. I sat with him until the day shift started at 6. When my colleague Dantum arrived for handover, I briefed him on the wing redressings, the repositioning of the rear limbs, the broth, and the eye. Dantum looked at the intake form, looked at the disposition recommendation box at the bottom, and looked at me. "Vera," he said. "The administrative review hasn't happened yet," I said. "It'll happen today." "Then I'll be back tonight," I said, "and we'll see what it says." I went home. I slept 4 hours. I came back. The administrative review had happened. The recommendation box now read, "Resource withdrawal, approved pending surgical team confirmation." I went to Bay 12. His eye was open when I came in. Both eyes this time, the left having been pressed against the platform on the first night swollen, which I hadn't been able to fully assess. They were the same extraordinary amber, both of them, and they tracked me from the moment I stepped through the bay doors. The broth bowl was empty. Something in my chest did a small, quiet thing that I did not pay excessive attention to. I sat on my stool. I set my kit on the floor. I looked at the intake form I'd brought with me, which I'd written my night shift notes on, and I read them back to him the way I always read my notes to patients. Not because they need to hear them necessarily, but because it is a form of accounting, and accounting done in the presence of the patient is more honest than accounting done in a back office. Wing membrane, right primary proximal dressing resecured. Distal edge still showing microtear propagation. I'm going to put a light splint on that tonight if you're willing. It'll feel odd. It won't hurt if I do it right. I looked up from the form. He was watching me. Rear limbs repositioned to neutral alignment. Dorsal wound, I can't do much with that until the surgical team clears it, and I don't know yet what the surgical team is going to decide. I paused. I want to be honest with you about that. You probably know your situation better than the intake form does. A long silence. The station's old bones groaned somewhere overhead. Then very slowly, the great crimson head moved. Not much, a matter of inches, but it moved on the platform, turning slightly toward me, and the eyes found mine at a more direct angle than before. I took that as the closest thing to a yes I was going to get that night, and I got to work. The light splint for the distal wing edge was the most technically difficult thing I'd done in years. I was not a surgical nurse. My field was intake care, monitoring, wound management, the long, slow, ordinary work of keeping somebody stable and comfortable while the dramatic interventions happened elsewhere. Splinting a section of battle dragon wing membrane was well outside my ordinary remit. I'd looked up the technique that afternoon on the station's medical reference system, read 3 different papers on non-human flight membrane stabilization, and made a jury-rigged splint from the materials I had. Lightweight composite stays from the supply cupboard, medical-grade adhesive strips, and a section of elasticized mesh bandaging that I was reasonably confident wouldn't cause secondary irritation to the membrane surface. It took 2 hours. I talked the whole time. I talked about the frontier zones, the ore surveys, the transit routes, the old processing levels of Thresh Station that nobody used anymore, the ones below the ward levels where the big extraction machinery still sat in the dark, perfectly maintained by the maintenance crews but never running, because the ore seams had played out 30 years ago and nobody had found new ones. I talked about the view from the clear-story windows. I talked about my son in the inner systems, who was an agricultural engineer and who called me every 3rd Sunday and always seemed surprised in a warm way that I was still at the frontier stations. I talked about the relay scout. She was under the desk again tonight, I said, not looking up from the splint work, keeping my hands steady. She'd eaten everything in her dish. She does that. She eats slowly during the day and then finishes everything right at the start of my shift, like she's been waiting. I made a small adjustment to the left stay. I brought her some of the rice porridge this morning. She'd never had it before. She held her head very still while she ate it, the way she does with new things. Something changed in his breathing. I was attuned to it by now, 6 nights in. I knew the range of his respiratory patterns the way I knew the ward monitors. There was a version of it that meant he was in pain and not saying so. There was a version that meant he was dropping toward sleep. There was a newer version, only a few nights old, that I thought of privately as the listening register. Slower than the others, quieter. He was in the listening register now. You know about relay scouts, of course, I said. More than I do, probably. I sat back from the splint work and looked at it critically. It was holding. I know they're draconic. I know they're used as communication relays in some lineages. I read about it once years ago in a briefing about the frontier transit corridors, but the reference material was vague about the specifics. I always assumed this one was just a wild stray. I looked over at him. Is that naive? He looked at me for a long moment. Then, so slowly it could almost have been involuntary, he moved his front left claw, the one that could still move, and tapped it twice against the platform padding. I sat very still. It had been 6 nights. He had not yet made a deliberate communicative gesture. He'd been too weak, or too cautious, or something else I didn't have a word for. I looked at the tap. I looked at him. His eyes were very steady. Twice, I said. Is that yes? 1 tap. I felt something shift in my understanding of the room, the station, the 6 weeks I'd been feeding scraps to a small bronze-gray creature under my intake desk. It was not a frightening shift. It was not alarming. It was the particular sensation of a picture coming into focus, not a new picture, but the real version of one you'd been looking at through a fog. She's not a stray, I said. 1 tap. She's been here on purpose. 1 tap. I sat with that for a moment. Outside the bay, the station groaned and settled. The monitors did their slow green work. I thought about the relay scout's quality of attention, the way she held her head, the way she'd been under that desk every single night for 6 weeks without exception, facing the ward. Not the kitchen, not the warmest wall, the ward. She reports back, I said. 1 tap. To someone, I said, to the Korath Ven. A pause, then 1 tap slower this time with a weight to it. I nodded. I didn't ask the next obvious question, whether they were watching me, whether I'd been observed, whether the scraps I'd fed a bronze-gray stray were known about by a war council on the other side of the frontier. I didn't ask it because it didn't change what I was doing, and asking it would have implied that it might. Well, I said, she seems comfortable. She eats everything I give her. He made a sound. It was the first sound he'd made that wasn't breathing, a low, resonant thing that came from deep in his chest and lasted only a second. I couldn't categorize it with any confidence, but it didn't feel like a warning. It felt, if I was going to be honest about it, a little like the sound a person makes when something is unexpectedly true and they don't have a word for that either. I looked at the splint, I looked at him. We should talk about the surgical team's recommendation, I said. His breathing steadied, he was listening. They've approved withdrawal, I said. That means they've decided the resources required to rehabilitate your injuries exceed what the station's protocols justify for a patient with your survival probability. I kept my voice level. This was a conversation I'd had before with human patients, and the voice that served them best was the same voice, plain, direct, without false comfort and without coldness. I disagree with the assessment, not emotionally, on the numbers. Your wing membrane is revascularizing. I can see it in the capillary response when I change the dressings. Your dorsal wound has stopped seeping. You're eating. Those are not the markers of a patient who should be written off. He was absolutely still. I've written a counter-assessment and submitted it to the senior medical officer. She hasn't responded yet. She may not respond the way I want her to. I picked up my notes. I'm telling you this because you have a right to know the situation, and because I think you've been around long enough to understand when someone is talking to you plainly. The claw moved, 1 tap. Good, I said. Then here's what I need from you. I looked at him directly. I need you to keep eating. I need you to let me work on the wings without fighting me, which you've been doing, and I'm grateful for it. And I need you to, I paused, choosing words. I need you to stay, that's all. Just stay. In the long silence that followed, the relay scout padded in under the gap in the bay doors. She'd been doing that for 3 nights now, coming in and sitting in the corner while I worked, and settled herself on the floor near the platform, tucked her wings and went still. Zareth looked at her. Then he looked at me. 2 taps. I took that to mean yes, and more than yes, and I did not ask him to explain the more than yes part, because some things don't require elaboration. The senior medical officer's response came on the 8th night. Counter-assessment noted, protocol holds, please ensure the patient is made comfortable. I read the message standing at the charge desk. The relay scout was watching me from her corner. I heard you, I said to neither of them and both of them. I'm going to Bay 12. What followed, what the next 4 weeks were, in the day-by-day grain of them, is harder to describe than the beginning was. The beginning had a shape to it. The arrival, the intake form, the first night, the first eye-opening. The middle weeks don't have that shape. They are the shape of work, which is to say they are repetition and small adjustment, and the accumulation of evidence that things are either going or not going in the direction you've aimed them. They were going. I could see it in the wing membrane, which was no longer propagating new tears and had begun, slowly, stubbornly, to show signs of repair at the edges of the damage. The microcirculation was returning. The tissue was anchoring to the splints instead of pulling away from them. I checked it the same way every night, not with instruments alone, but by looking closely at the surface in the bay's brightest light, which meant bringing a handheld examination lamp, and holding it at a low angle to the membrane so the capillary network showed up against the translucency of the tissue. On a healthy wing, the network is dense, ordered, a map of branching lines that carries the blood that keeps the membrane flexible and resistant. On Zareth's damaged sections, when I'd first started working, those lines had been absent, collapsed, cut off by the blast damage, the tissue pale and stiff and pulling at the edges. I knew what membrane death looked like. I had been watching for it every night. It didn't come. By the end of the second week, the first very faint traces of returning circulation were visible at the boundary between the damaged and undamaged zones. Not the dense, ordered network of a healthy membrane, but the tentative, branching first efforts of tissue that is trying to repair itself. I sat with the examination lamp held at its low angle and looked at those first faint lines for probably longer than was strictly necessary. Then I updated my assessment notes, went to the staff kitchen, made a cup of the station's very bad coffee, and sat at the charge desk for 5 minutes not thinking about anything in particular. When I went back to Bay 12, Zareth was watching the bay doors with a quality of attention that I'd come to understand meant he'd been listening to my footsteps. "It's working," I said. He didn't move, but his breathing shifted into the listening register, slow and deep. "The membrane," I said, "where the damage is worst, the circulation is coming back." I sat on my stool, I set the lamp down. "It'll take time, and it won't be what it was, but it's working." A long silence. Then slow and certain, one tap. A surgical nurse from the day team, Petran, who'd heard about what I was doing from Dantum, came by on the 9th night with a set of proper wing stabilization stays that were a significant improvement on my composite jury rig. He didn't say much. Petran rarely said much, just set the supplies down and looked at the wing work and said, "Not bad for intake." Then he left. He came back the next night with a different set of supplies and a reference text on Korath-Ven wing anatomy that he'd pulled from the station's research archive. He left that too. I could see the progress in Zareth's rear limbs as well, in a negative way, in what wasn't happening. The limbs were still paralyzed. That had not changed, and I did not expect it to. Spinal compression wounds of that severity rarely resolve fully, and I'd stopped pretending to myself that full mobility was the target. The target was preventing secondary deterioration. The target was getting him to a baseline where he wasn't in constant residual pain from the original injury being compounded by the way he had to hold his body. Neutral alignment, pressure redistribution, range of motion work on what he could still move to keep the circulation in the affected area from stagnating. He tolerated all of it. More than tolerated, he participated in the limited ways available to him. When I needed him to shift his weight for limb repositioning, he did it. When I needed him to hold still for the wing work, he held still. When I talked him through what I was about to do before I did it, he listened, and his breathing told me whether he understood. I learned the register for yes, and the register for I would rather not, but I will, and the register for that is more painful than you think it is, which I treated the same way I'd treat the same information from any patient. "Thank you for telling me. Let me adjust." What I hadn't expected, and what I found myself thinking about in the hours between shifts, was the shame. I'd seen it from the first morning when his eye opened. I'd recognized it without being able to name it right away. That quality of stillness that wasn't submission, wasn't resignation, was something more specific than either of those. A battle dragon of the Korath-Ven is not a creature built for stillness. The Korath-Ven bloodline has been the most feared combat lineage on the frontier for as long as there has been a frontier worth fearing anyone on. They are built for command of space, of sky, of terrain, of the political weight that comes with being capable of both. A mature adult male of this bloodline lying on a recovery platform with his wings in dressings and his rear limbs paralyzed, in a triage bay that a station administrator had earmarked for resource withdrawal, was as far from the life his body was built for as it was possible to get. He knew it, that was the thing. He knew it with the full awareness of a creature who understood exactly what he'd been and what he now was. And the distance between those two things was what I saw in his eyes every night when I came through the bay doors. I didn't try to talk him out of it. You don't talk someone out of shame like that. What you do is keep showing up and keep treating them like they're worth the showing up and let time and work do what reassurance cannot. That's not a theory I'd read anywhere. It's something I'd learned from 34 years of night shifts, from the human patients who'd come in broken in ways that had nothing to do with their bodies, and from the work of staying in a room with them until the room felt different. The room did feel different by the end of the third week. I couldn't have said exactly when the change happened. It wasn't a single night, it was accumulated, the way most real changes are. But there was a night, around day 20, when I looked up from the wing work and found him watching me not with the shame weight but with something else. Something quieter. An attention that was not self-directed, not turned inward on the distance between what he'd been and what he was. Just present. Just watching. I didn't say anything about it. I went back to the wing work. The broth became a routine, warm at the start of each shift before the work started. I'd added solid food by the second week. The station's supply chain didn't stock dragon-appropriate nutrition in any meaningful quantity, but there was a freight run that came through twice a week from the inner frontier depots, and I put in a request through the station quartermaster for high-protein supplemental rations. The quartermaster, a woman named Bish who'd been doing the job for 20 years and had seen everything, had looked at the request form, looked at the species designation, and looked at me. "Battle-class adult male," she said. "Yes," I said. "The disposition on file says resource withdrawal." "The disposition on file is under review," I said, which was not precisely accurate but was not precisely inaccurate either, because I had filed a second counter-assessment on the 10th night, and that one was technically still awaiting a response. Bish studied the form for a long moment. "The freight run comes in Tuesday and Friday," she said. "I'll see what I can do." What she could do, it turned out, was considerable. The first supplemental shipment arrived that Friday, 3 crates of high-density ration packs, plus a separate sealed container that Bish had labeled only as special order, ward use, and which turned out to contain, when I opened it in the supply room, a 40-pound bag of dried mountain grain that I recognized as a traditional component of high-altitude draconic diets from the Thresh Plateau region. I stood in the supply room for a moment with the bag in my hands, wondering who Bish had called and what she'd said, and whether Bish had been paying closer attention to Bay 12 than I'd realized. I put the mountain grain in a pot with water and warmed it and brought it in on the 12th night. Zareth smelled it before I came through the bay doors. I could tell by the way his head came up, not sharply, not a threat response, but the way a very restrained person lets something show in their face when something is unexpectedly right. His front claw was already moving when I set the bowl down. 2 taps, which by now had accumulated a secondary meaning, not just yes but something closer to "I see what you did." "Bish sourced it," I said. "Credit goes to her." He tapped twice again. "I'll tell her," I said. I sat on my stool. He ate slowly, with the careful dignity of a creature who is very hungry and has decided that haste is beneath him. The relay scout sat in her corner and watched us both. I had started talking to the relay scout directly in the second week. Not to Zareth through the relay scout. That distinction seemed important somehow, so I was careful about it. I talked to Zareth about Zareth's treatment. I talked to the relay scout about whatever was in my head, the way you talk to a cat or a bird, the ambient talk of someone who lives alone and has gotten comfortable with an audience that doesn't answer back. I talked about the station's history, the ore surveys, the years of extraction, the played-out seams, the long quiet that followed. I talked about the frontier zones in general terms, the transit corridors, the contested margins, the small human outposts scattered along the edges of the Korethven territorial boundary, places like Thresh Station that existed in the interstices of larger powers, without being much of a prize for anyone. "This ward gets about 30 admissions a month," I said one night, not to anyone in particular. "Mostly transit injuries, minor fractures, decompression exposure, standard stuff. Maybe 2 or 3 a month that are more serious. We're not a major facility. We don't have the surgical depth for it. What we have is the night shift, and the night shift has me." I glanced at the relay scout. She was in her listening posture, chin level, eyes bright. "I've been doing this for 34 years, if you count my first post in the inner systems, 22 of those years on the frontier stations. I came out here because—" I stopped. Zareth was watching me. I don't entirely remember why anymore. Something about the edge of things. Something about the places where people end up when they're between one thing and another. I've always thought those places need nurses more than the comfortable places do. Zareth's breathing was in the listening register. "You were between one thing and another when they brought you in," I said. "Whatever happened out there, I don't know the details and I don't need to. You ended up here. And here is where I am." I shrugged. "That seems like reason enough to get on with it." The relay scout made a small sound. Not a distress sound. I knew her distress sounds, and this wasn't one of them. It was something else. A small, low-frequency thing, barely above the ambient noise of the station. Zareth made the same sound back, and then his breathing changed. Not the pain register, not the sleep-dropping register. Something I hadn't heard before. It took me a moment to understand what I was hearing, because I'd never heard it from him in 6 weeks of night shifts, had begun to think perhaps I wouldn't. It was the register of something released. I didn't name it. I didn't ask about it. I went back to the wing work, and the room was quiet, and the relay scout stayed in her corner with her eyes bright, and the station groaned and settled around us in the dark. On the 19th night, I came in and found Zareth sitting up. Not standing. The rear limbs were not capable of supporting his weight, and the primary flight wings were still in stabilizing dressings. But the upper body, his torso, his neck, his great head. He had leveraged himself upright using his front limbs and his tail, and he was sitting up on the recovery platform with his back against the bay wall, and when I came through the doors, he was looking at the observation panel in the upper left corner as though he'd been watching the ward for some time. I stopped in the doorway. He looked at me. I looked at him. "Good morning," I said. He moved his front claw, 2 taps, then a pause, then 1 tap, a pattern he hadn't used before. I went to my stool. I sat down. I thought about it. 2 and 1, I said. 2 is yes, or I see what you did. 1 is yes, or something more than yes. I considered. 2 and 1, I see what you did and something more than yes. He watched me working through it with that quality of patience that had become one of the things I most recognized about him. Not the patience of someone waiting for you to catch up. The patience of someone who has decided you are worth waiting for. "Are you trying to say thank you?" I said. 1 tap. "You don't need to," I said. Silence. "I mean it. You don't owe me thanks for doing my job. If I'd followed the disposition recommendation you'd be—" I stopped. "You don't owe me anything." A very long pause. The relay scout shifted in her corner. Then Zareth moved his claw again, 2 taps and a pause and 1 tap, and then slow, deliberate 2 more taps. I looked at the sequence. 212, yes, more than yes, yes. I wasn't sure I had the vocabulary for what he was saying. I suspected I did, and I suspected it wasn't about thanks in the way I'd meant thanks, the transaction of gratitude, one person to another. I suspected it was something closer to, I see what you did, and more than that, and I see you. I sat with that for a while. Then I said, "All right. Let's look at the wings." There was a night around the 4th week when I came in to find the relay scout not under the intake desk but sitting on top of it. Not sleeping, upright, alert, the wings slightly spread. I'd never seen her sit like that before. I stood at the charge desk for a moment and looked at her. "What is it?" I said. She made the low sound, the one she and Zareth had exchanged. I went to Bay 12. Zareth was sitting up. He could do that reliably now, and when I came through the doors I could tell immediately, from the set of his body and the quality of his alertness, that something was different tonight. He wasn't in distress, but he was paying attention to something I couldn't see or hear yet. "What do you know that I don't?" I said. 212. "That's not an answer," I said, but not unkindly. I went through the night's work in the usual order: the wing dressings, the limb repositioning, the monitoring, the broth. He was cooperative and steady and watching. There were long stretches of silence that felt different from the usual working silences, charged, somehow, with a quality of waiting. About halfway through the shift he tapped. Not 212, not the usual patterns, but a longer sequence. Slow, precise. 4 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, 3 taps. I counted again. I set down what I was holding and looked at him. There's a kind of communication that happens in long, close quarters work between people, or apparently between a person and something else, that develops its own grammar without either party deciding to develop one. You start with blunt tools, yes and no, discomfort and ease, the breathing registers and the claw taps. And somewhere in the accumulation of nights, without a meeting, without a plan, without anyone formally proposing it, the vocabulary expands. Not into language exactly. Into something with the structural bones of language, intention, specificity. The difference between I want to convey a fact and I want to convey how I feel about a fact. The tap pattern was fact-shaped, not sentiment-shaped. He was trying to tell me something that needed more precision than 212 could carry. I didn't have a cipher for it. We hadn't built one. Our communication had been gestural and tonal and contextual, not coded. But the precision of it was different from the emotional communications. It felt like an attempt to convey information rather than sentiment. "I don't know what that means," I said. "I'm sorry." He was quiet for a moment. Then he tried something different. He brought his front claw up slowly, carefully, given the wing dressings, and pointed, not vaguely, specifically, toward the bay's observation panel. I went to it. I looked through it into the ward, into the dark, quiet corridor beyond. Nothing at first. Then at the far end of the corridor, where the outer freight doors gave onto the loading bay level, a light. Just a narrow strip of it, from the seam of a door being opened slowly. It was 4 in the morning. Freight runs didn't come through at 4 in the morning. I went back to my stool. I sat down. I looked at Zareth. "How long have you known?" I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then one tap, steady and clear. "Since the first night," I thought, or close to it, since whoever the relay scout reported back to had begun to know. "Are they coming for you?" I said. One tap. "Now." One tap. I took a breath. I thought about the intake form. I thought about the disposition box and the administrative review and the senior medical officer's response. I thought about Petran's wing stabilization stays and Bish's mountain grain, and the second and third counter-assessments that were still technically awaiting a response. "Are you safe?" I said. "With them, are you going to be all right?" He held my gaze for a long time, long enough that the station's lights ran through half a cycle overhead. Then very slowly, one tap, not emphatic, certain. I nodded. "Then I'm going to finish the wing dressings," I said, and I picked up my kit and got back to work. They came through the bay doors about 20 minutes later. There were 4 of them. 3 adults and an elder, the elder I could distinguish by size alone, which was of a different order from Zareth's, the way a mountain is a different order from a hill, and also by the color, which was not crimson like Zareth's but a deep violet black that seemed to pull the light toward it rather than reflect it. The 3 adults flanked the elder in a formation that was clearly ceremonial, clearly deliberate, and not the arrangement of a rescue party or an extraction team. The relay scout came in behind them. She sat in her usual corner, She looked at me. The elder stopped about 10 feet from the recovery platform. Zareth was sitting up, which I'd noticed him do more deliberately in the last 2 nights, as if he'd been practicing for something. His front limbs were settled. His head was level. His breathing was steady. He looked, for the first time since I'd met him, like the thing the intake form had described him as: not broken, not triaged, not a resource withdrawal pending administrative review. He looked like what he was. The elder looked at him for a long time. Then the elder looked at me. I had some idea by this point of what I was looking at. I had spent 6 weeks feeding a relay scout. I had spent 6 weeks talking in the presence of that relay scout about rice porridge and clear-story windows, and the way a frontier ward runs at 4 in the morning, and why I'd come out to the edge of things in the first place. I had some idea that all of that had been heard. I had some idea of what it meant that the Korathven War Council had sent an elder and 3 adults instead of a medical extraction team. But knowing a thing is coming and standing in it are not the same. The elder was looking at me with eyes that were not amber but a deep, still gray, the gray of very old stone, of something that had been in the world a very long time and had learned the difference between what was rare and what was not. The look held in it an assessment that was nothing like the intake form's assessment. It held in it the knowledge of 6 weeks of night shifts. I didn't look away. The elder made a sound, a long, low resonance, not a word in any language I had, but carrying in it the shape of language, the weight and cadence of something intended to be received. The relay scout from her corner made the same sound back. Then the elder bowed. Not a small inclination, not a nod, a full, deliberate bow, the great violet-black head lowering, the neck curving, the ancient body carrying the gesture through to its completion without hurry and without ambiguity. The 3 adults bowed with him. I stood in the middle of Bay 12 at 4 in the morning with my supply kit in my hand and my work clothes on, the ones I wore for every night shift because they were practical and I didn't think about them. And I received that bow in the only way I knew how to receive it, which was to receive it plainly, without flinching and without theater. The elder straightened. He looked at me for a long moment more, and I thought he was going to speak. There are Korathven who speak the common frontier tongue. I'd read that too, somewhere, but he didn't. He looked at Zareth. He looked at the relay scout. He looked for one long second at the wing dressings, which were Petran's proper stabilization stays over the composite jury-rig framework I'd built in the first week, and which were, I thought, doing their job. Then he looked back at me, and the look said, in the way a look sometimes can, I came to see for myself. I have seen. He made a sound to Zareth. Zareth made a sound back. Longer. There was a quality to it I hadn't heard from him before, not the pain register or the sleep register or the listening register or the released register. Something older than all of those, something that had been waiting. The elder listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt. When Zareth was done, the elder made a single short sound. Then he turned, and the 3 adults turned with him, and they left the way they'd come, back through the freight doors into the loading bay level, back into the pre-dawn dark of the frontier zone beyond. The relay scout stayed. I stood in the middle of the bay for a moment. Then I went back to my stool. I sat down. I looked at Zareth. "Well," I said. He looked at me. 212. I had the vocabulary for it now. I see what you did, and more than that, and I see you. "Yes," I said, "all right." I picked up my kit and finished the wing dressings. The relay scout sat in her corner and watched us until the first light came through the clear-story windows of the upper processing level, that particular pre-dawn quality that you could only see from the ward's east-facing bays at the right angle, which Bay 12 was. I'd noticed that when I first moved Zareth there on the second night, that it was east-facing, that the light would come in. I hadn't said anything about it at the time. I don't know if it mattered. I like to think it mattered. The day shift came in at 6. Dantum was first through the ward doors. the way he always was, 15 minutes early with a coffee he bought from the machine on the upper level and drank too fast. He looked at me at the charge desk. "Good night," he said. "Busy?" I said. He nodded. He went to do his rounds. I wrote my notes. At 6:40, I sent a message to the senior medical officer. It read, "Ray Zareth of the Korathven, Bay 12, disposal recommendation. Please note the following clinical observations from the past 3 weeks. Primary wing membrane revascularization progressing ahead of conservative estimate. Dorsal wound fully closed, no seepage for 11 days. Patient ambulatory from torso through front limbs. Eating well. No behavioral indicators consistent with resource withdrawal criteria. I am formally requesting a full clinical review, and I am formally requesting that the disposition notation be updated to ongoing care, night shift primary." I put the message in the outbox. Then I put on my coat and went home. I slept well that day. Longer than usual. I woke up once around noon and heard the specific silence of a frontier zone midday, which is nothing like the silences of the inner systems. And I thought about the elder's bow and Zareth's long sound, and the way the relay scout had been in her usual corner the whole time, watching everything, the way she always did. Then I went back to sleep. The senior medical officer responded at 3 in the afternoon. Disposition notation updated, clinical review scheduled, night shift primary, OSI V. I didn't see the message until I came in for my shift. It was a Thursday morning. The rice porridge was on. I stopped at the kitchen on the way to the charge desk and ladled a bowl. I brought it to the charge desk and sat down and read the overnight notes. Bay 3 had a new admission, a young male from one of the outer frontier depots, fractured collarbone, nothing complicated. Bay 7's patient had been discharged. The rest of the ward was stable. At the bottom of the overnight notes in Dantum's handwriting was a small additional entry. Bay 12 patient showing increased upper body mobility. Front limbs bearing full weight. Vocal activity noted. I read that last line twice. Vocal activity. I put down the overnight notes. I put on my gloves. I finished the porridge standing at the charge desk, and then I carried the empty bowl to the kitchen and came back. The relay scout was in her corner, bright-eyed, awake. "Good morning," I said to her. She made the low sound. I went to Bay 12. He was sitting up straight, the way he'd learned to do, and when I came through the doors he made a sound, not the 212 tap pattern, not a breathing register, but an actual sound. Clear, intentional, aimed at me. A single resonant note that lasted perhaps 2 seconds and then faded. It didn't sound like my name. I didn't expect it to. But it sounded like something. It sounded, in the way a sound sometimes carries the shape of something larger than itself, like a door opening. "Good morning," I said. He made the sound again. The same note, steady, not a question, a greeting. I stood there for a moment, in the east-facing bay, with the pre-dawn light beginning its slow arrival through the clerestory windows somewhere above us, and received that greeting the way I'd received everything else over 6 weeks of night shifts, plainly, without theater, in the manner of someone who is at work in the place they are supposed to be. "All right," I said, "let's have a look at those wings." I set my kit on the floor. I pulled my stool up to the recovery platform. I began the assessment notes the way I began them every night, going through the standard checklist in the same order, checking each item against the previous night's notation. Wing membrane, right primary. Revascularization continuing, microtear propagation arrested, membrane surface gaining stability at proximal dressing boundary. Wing membrane left primary, similar progress slightly ahead of right. Dorsal wound, closed, no seepage surrounding tissue firm. Rear limbs, no change in motor function, no secondary deterioration, positioning maintained. Front limbs, full weight bearing confirmed. Vocal activity, noted. I closed the assessment notes. I looked at him. He was watching me with those extraordinary amber eyes, the same ones that had found me across 4 feet of bay space on the first morning he'd opened them. And I thought about the intake form and its small disposition box, and the phrase resource withdrawal pending administrative review. And I thought about the 6 weeks between that form and this morning. The broth and the splints and the mountain grain and Petran's wing stabilization, Stays and Bish's special order, and the relay scout's steady bronze-gray attention, and the elder's bow and Zareth's long sound, and the way the east light came through the clear-story windows, at just the right angle if you were in Bay 12 on a clear morning. "You're going to be all right," I said, not a prognosis, not a clinical statement. Something simpler than that. He made the sound, the greeting sound, the one that had started this morning, but sustained this time, and with something in the sustaining of it that I didn't have words for and didn't try to find words for, because not everything needs words. I nodded. "I know," I said. I stood up. I went to the bay doors. I stopped, my hand on the release. Bay 3 had a new admission. A young male from the outer frontier depot with a fractured collarbone. He'd been brought in overnight, and he'd be awake by now, and he'd need to know who was looking after him. I looked back at Zareth once. He was watching me with the particular quality that had been there since the first morning. Not the shame, not that anymore, but the thing on the other side of it. The thing you get to when the shame has been outweighted and outworked, and the world has decided, against its own recommendation, to keep you in it. I'd worked with enough patience to know you don't see that look come back in everyone. Some of them hold onto the shame the way you hold onto something you've had long enough to mistake for yourself. But when it does come back, that particular quality of presence, of someone occupying their own existence again without apology, it's the thing in this profession that makes the rest of it make sense. The forms and the protocols and the bad coffee and the disposition boxes and the counter-assessments that go unanswered for 10 days. You do all of that for the moments when it comes back. I pulled on my gloves. "I want to see the next patient,"